Is there some interplay between what people experience as flow states and the activation or use of multiple forms of knowing? Or did I just pull that out of the air?
No, I have argued for that thesis. So I don't know if that makes it a fact, but I would definitely argue on his behalf. I think, I've published and done work on the flow state, and I think the flow state is an example of, in our experience, a prioritization of the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory over the propositional. In fact, one of the things people reliably report is that whole propositional processing drops out. Even that narrative nanny, the thing in your head that's like, how am I doing? How do I look? Do people like me?
Yeah.
How am I doing? Maybe I should lose some weight. How am I doing? How's my hair? Right? That all falls away. This goes to what I was saying a few minutes ago. There's this enlivening, enriching of a sense of contact. One of the defining features of the flow state is people feel at one with their environment. They feel dynamically coupled to it. They feel so that's participatory. They feel at one with it. And the perspectival, everything is super salient. There's an ongoing sense of discovery, of even almost like insight. And I've argued it's an insight cascade, and you're getting even more, you're getting super present. And then, of course, the procedurality is you just know how to do it. And it just flows, hence the word, it just flows from you. And what's really important, Tim, is that, the flow state is optimal for people. They think they're at their best, with good reason. And they'll say it's one of the best experiences they had, one of the most rewarding, even more rewarding than pleasure. So much so that asking people how frequently they get into the flow state is a good predictor of their sense of well-being. And so here's the point I want to make about that. This is a clear example of that non-propositional connectedness. Flow is about really realizing the transjectivity, the connectedness, and how much it contributes to a sense of agency and meaning for people.
Yeah. I think we're going to jump in the deep end of the meaning pool shortly. Let me ask you first, though, given what you just said, how highly do you prioritize getting into flow states yourself? And if the answer is reasonably high or higher, how do you personally like to get into flow states?
So I've said this, and I mean this deeply, and I don't mean it as a trivial commodification. Taoism is the religion philosophy of flow. Right? And I've been practicing Taoist practices, Tai Chi Chuan, Jianzheng, Yi Chuan, Qigong. I got professional training and practice for 10 years as a shiatsu therapist. I've done it all. Well, not at all. That's pretentious, but I've done a lot. Okay, that's fair, right? And what those things do, and this is something I want to talk to you about at some point, they get me into a flow state, but in a particular way that I think is really important. And this goes to a story I've told. I was in grad school, and I'd been doing Tai Chi Chuan for about 3 or 4 years. And I was doing it really religiously, both in the sense of devotedly, and I was doing it like 2 or 3 hours a day, and going to the dojo 3 or 4 times a week, kind of thing. And some of my fellow students came up to me and said, "What's going on with you? What are you doing differently?" I'm like, you're worried in grad school that people are going to find you out. And so I said, "I'm doing Tai Chi Chuan." But before I said that, I said, "Well, why are you saying that?" And they said, "Well, because you're just more, like in conversations, you're much more flowing, and you're much more flexible, and you're much more balanced, and you're much more receptive." And it was like, the flow state that I'm getting into in Tai Chi is permeating many different domains of my life and many different levels of my mind. And I thought, and this is a question, this has become a question to me. What are the contexts that generate flow that transfers like that powerfully?
Yeah.
Versus the context where the flow stays locked into that particular context?
That is a great question. That is such a good question.
Yeah.
And where have you gone with that?
Well, I've gone with that in several different directions. And it's very much a work in progress. So I ask for some charity on the part of listeners. This is something I'm very much working on right now. I'm glad you think it's a great question because, even if you get a good question, then you're a good scientist. Then you're doing something, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things I think has to do with whether or not the skill or the skill set that's being trained in the particular practice is relatively indispensable in domains other than the situation you're in. Now, ideas about sensory motor movement and balance and coordination and getting the cerebellum and the frontal cortex to talk better to each other, that transfers broadly. We've already got a lot of information, like evidence about that, especially the cerebellum cortex loop. That, like, even when people are meditating, the cerebellum is firing like crazy because of the cerebellum cortex loop. And so if it does that, it even shows up in the metaphors. We talk about balancing equations and justice being the balancing of things and scales. And so, like, you want to find a set of skills that has that inbuilt potential. And then what I would want to say is the degree to which there has been a framework built around the situation, a ritual philosophical framework that helps to afford the translation. So around the Tai Chi Chuan, you have Taoism, which gives you this way of framing reality as yin and yang that you can see instantiated in the Tai Chi, but you can also see it prevalent in the world. You set up the possibility with this framework for the resonance. And so people who get trapped, and I'm not saying that all video games trap people, but the ones that suffer from video game addiction, they get the problem that they flow in a world that does not have a framework around it, does not tap into those generally transferable skills. And so they find the external world depressing because of its absence of flow potential. That drives them into the game where they flow, and then you get the vicious cycle that gets you into the addiction. So I think there's something about, are the kinds of skills that are being brought into the flow state, do they have this domain general power? And is there a framework around it that helps people set up these patterns of resonance between what they're doing in the practice and how they're seeing the world and encountering it?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. If there is some overarching philosophical framework or religious framework, for that matter, within which you're practicing a given skill, there's a broader context that then extends whatever you're honing in this specific situation to other domains. And it makes me think actually of a friend of mine. His name is Josh Waitzkin. He was the basis for Searching for Bobby Fischer, the book and the movie. Of course, very, very high level chess player. But he talks a lot. He no longer plays chess. He does a million other things. He was actually world champion in Tai Chi push hands. And what I find I shouldn't say most interesting, he's a lovely, deeply soulful guy. So it's not that I'm looking at him as a sort of instrument of learning mastery, but he is able to take concepts from all these different disciplines and apply them in transfers to all of these other things. So for instance, in chess, he talks a lot about practicing the macro in the micro, or learning the macro from the micro. So he'll say, chess people, often novices will say practice openings, but that's kind of like copying from the teacher's answer book. You're memorizing a lot in terms of declarative knowledge, but you're not learning principles. So he'll say, why don't you start with, let's just say 3 or 4 or 5 pieces on the board, and you're going to practice manipulating empty space or pulling into a vacuum. And lo and behold, a lot of those same principles transferred over to Tai Chi. And then he took principles from Tai Chi and moved them over into foil boarding. Is Tai Chi your go-to break glass in case of emergency tool in the department of flow states, or do you have other approaches in the quiver?
Yeah. And this comes from the Socratic part of my framework, if you want to put it that way. That sounds very pretentious. So, but
I'm into it.
I have learned how to get into the flow state when lecturing. That inevitably affords really good learning. Of course, not for every student. That would become something that's impossible. No teacher is a great teacher to every student, right? But I mean, I've won teaching awards, et cetera, and that's because of this. And very often students get drawn into it because I encourage a lot of sort of Socratic dialogue in the lecture. And so it very much often becomes a shared flow state. I become very interested in shared flow states and what they mean for how we can unpack sort of the capacity for insight and reflection. So that's one of my other go-to areas.
Let's unpack that a little bit. So in lecturing, did you do that naturally from the outset, kind of like Usain Bolt having just different tendon attachments and so on. You can just run fast. So did that come out of the box for you, or was that shared flow state in the form of lecturing a learned skill? If so, how did you develop that?
So very much a cultivated thing, and deliberately so. By nature, I'm almost pathologically shy. And so I didn't realize it was a lesson from Aristotle at the time, but you cultivate your character to compensate for your personality defects. And so I've read my report cards from grade 3, and they were calling me mini teacher. So taking on the role of the teacher, and I was fortunate to have some really wonderful teachers that allowed this, and to have classmates that enjoyed it. I mean, think of all the conditions, how that could have gone wrong, right? So very fortunate. And that was how I started to manage that situation.
Manage a situation, you mean manage your shyness by assuming the role of teacher.
Yes, right. The full sort of persona and the role. So Tim, if like this is close enough to teaching, and I don't mean to put you in the role of a student, I'm not saying that, but it's close enough, it's in proximity for transfer.
Oh, I'm a student.
Yep. Well, anyways, it's comfortable. But I mean, if you were to meet me like at a social party, I'm at times indistinguishable from potted plants, right? Because when I don't have that role available to me, my sort of natural constitution comes out. So it was very deliberately cultivated from very, very early on. And then as I started doing Tai Chi Chuan, when I started in grad school hearing about the bleed, that's when I started to teach and lecture. And I looked for it, and I looked for what broke it and what enhanced it. And I slowly cultivated it more and more over time. Yes, it was very much a deliberate, long-term cultivation.
What enhances it? Because you take, just grab an example out of the air, Harvard Business School. They have these case study methods, and there is ostensibly supposed to be a fair amount of interplay between lecturer and student. But I would imagine that not all professors or grad students or whoever is doing the teaching at the time would say they achieve a flow state, even if they've experienced it in other places like surfing. So what have you found to be things that enhance that for yourself and for the students?
Part of this, I'm going to declare a bias because I have a published theory about what I think the flow state is. I think it's an insight cascade and the enhancement of implicit learning. So we cultivate better insight capacities, we cultivate better intuition in an integrated manner. Now that goes, so I'm stating the bias up front, but I think it's a good theory, and I think it's well argued and well evidenced. So, but what I mean by that is, like more and more I crafted giving priority to the emergence of insight or intuition in me as I was lecturing, and not sticking to the script so strongly, but willing to bend. So I use the jazz analogy. I may have the script of the lecture, but I can riff on it, and I look and I hunger and sensitize myself for that. And then when the students start to even demonstrate sort of proto-insight, I will really call that out, I mean in a positive manner, and draw it out, and they get, right? And they start priming each other with insights, and they start priming me, and I start priming them. And so it's an easy thing to state, and it's a hard thing to do. Because when you're lecturing, and when I teach people how to lecture, I actually try to get them to make space for the jazz. Because what you do when you're anxious, and one of the things that really kills it a lot is PowerPoint, right? Because what you want is, I need to say all of these things, and I need to be clear, and I need to have everything follow. And so you get really, like, you try to constrain your anxiety with the tightness of this structure that you built. Yep. And what that actually does is that undermines the possibility of flow. And so it's like Tai Chi Chuan, right? You want to be peng. Don't want to be too yin, too yang. You got to loosen the structure enough so that insight and intuition flow, but not so much that the lecture becomes incoherent. And you find the sweet spot.